All right. Thank you for joining us today for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History Lunch and Learn, Mouth to Mouth, the Tooth Trade in Washington's World. Our presenter today, Lucy Smith, is a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, and she visited the Connecticut Museum in May, and we are very excited to hear about some of her findings today. Lucy is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan in the Joint History and Women and Gender Studies program. Her dissertation examines the cultural history of human teeth in the early American Republic, and this has taken her to 34 archives in 21 cities, pretty impressive, across the US. And prior to graduate school, Lucy worked for nearly a decade in the museum world, most recently as the education specialist at George Washington's Mount Vernon. So welcome, Lucy. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to be with you all and have you all be here during your lunch break. And a particular thank you to the Connecticut Museum for Culture and History for being fabulous hosts and a really great, amazing staff to work with as they pulled thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of ledgers for me to go through throughout that time. And I'm still processing a lot of that data, but it's been really exciting to find some really great hooks that we're going to be talking about a little bit about today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see uncomfortable images. It's very exciting. Perfect. And before we get started, I just always like to give folks kind of a heads up on this one. This topic is visceral in many ways. It's dealing with issues like medicine, extraction, forced extraction, enslavement. It can get a little uncomfortable at times. And, as my mother would say, this is not exactly a dinner table conversation. We're doing it during the lunch hour. So I want to give folks a heads up and warn you as well that if you were already scared of the dentist, this is not going to help you at all. So with that said, let's go ahead and hop into Mouth to Mouth, the tooth trade in Washington's world. Oh, and I should say on the offset, I'm dealing with a sinus infection right now, so if my voice breaks out, we'll get through it together, y'all. We'll get through it together. So in September of 1793, Dr. Richard S. Skinner posted this ad in the Connecticut newspaper. He says, respectfully informs the ladies and gentlemen of the city that he has arrived and may be consulted any hour between 8 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon at Captain Ramsey's near the courthouse. The personal ornament and great advantage resulting from a clean, handsome, sound set of teeth must be obvious to every person of discernment, particularly to the ladies and the orators. To the former, they have the luster to every charm and essentially contributing to that beautiful symmetry inseparably annexed to their native loveliness. And to the latter, they preserve the distinct pronunciation and cleanliness of articulation so necessary to public speakers, which can never be retained by those who have been unfortunate to lose their front teeth. Now, this was a pretty common ad. We saw it a lot in the 18th century. You open pretty much any 18th century newspaper in the United States, you're going to see advertisements like this of dentists, quasi-dentists, charlatan-esque dentists, all kind of selling their kind of wares in the marketplace. And Skinner is one of those. But the phrase that I think really shows and we're going to focus a lot about is there at the end, where he's talking about how this kind of clearness of articulation is so necessary, which can never be retained by those who are unfortunate as to lose their front teeth. In other words, if you don't have your front teeth, you are not going to be seen as, beautiful symmetry and native loveliness and all of that if you're a lady. But also if you're a gentleman and you're existing in kind of polite society, you can't be part of that because you're not going to be able to kind of talk and perform in a certain kind of way. And this becomes a real source of anxiety throughout the kind of 18th century as they're kind of going through it and thinking about tooth loss. So this is from one of those mini account books I looked at while I was at the Connecticut Historical. We can see they're pulling teeth left and right because tooth loss is a large thing that happens. But throughout the 18th century, tooth loss takes on a really different series of kind of connotations and meanings. And this happens for a couple reasons. First of all, people are living a lot longer. So tooth loss becomes more of a thing, essentially, as people kind of age. But also there's expanded marketplaces. So people are consuming sugar and tea and coffee and chocolate and Madeira. Their diets are really radically changing kind of as well. That's leading to these like different kinds of anxieties around tooth loss. And so essentially this all gets kind of paired with kind of changes within the medical field. So throughout the 18th century, there's this kind of large shift where people go from not really caring about tooth loss to reading people's mouths and bodies. And what I mean by that is they're looking at someone's smile and they're making assumptions and connotations on them. We do this today, right? We can think about the rise proliferation of braces in our society. If you get any kind of executive training, the first thing they say is teeth whitening and straight teeth, right? We still judge people based on their mouth and their smile. But this shift that happens throughout the 18th century has been explored by some other scholars like Colin Jones and Jennifer Van Horn. But today we're not really going to look so much at that. Today, instead, we're going to look at kind of the result of this transition where teeth become associated with loveliness and public speaking, as we saw with Skinner, and become a virtuous person of good character, right? If you've got that nice smile. So we're going to be looking at kind of the effects of that, which kind of manifests itself in this transatlantic tooth trade that we'll be looking at. But just to give some folks some kind of quick history of dentistry 101 kind of context. What you're seeing on the screen here is kind of like what it used to be like. So before this kind of solidification of the dentist as a former medical person, right? You have these kinds of images as well, and these are kind of tooth drawers. So you would go to your tooth drawer because even though there wasn't maybe as much tooth loss because diets, teeth break, teeth have nerves, teeth it happens, right? And so they're excruciatingly painful. If you've ever had a toothache, you'll know that. So you would go to these tooth drawers, and they tended to be kind of two different kinds. Either one would be the gentleman or that we see that's kind of like performing there in front of a sturge, they're even playing music. It's a spectacle and it's a show that you're going to go to, right? As someone screams in pain. The other image is more like a blacksmith shop where you're going to have somebody with a tool physically pulling them out. Blacksmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, they all kind of tend to be that person you would also go to if you were maybe a smaller village. The reason being is twofold. One, it takes a lot of physical strength to remove a tooth, right? It is like if they want to be in there, they want to be in there. So you need a level of physical strength to do it. So someone like a blacksmith is going to have that physical strength. You also probably want somebody who's got tools and a level of fine motor skills while they're in your mouth, right? So someone like a silversmith or goldsmith becomes a pretty good option in that way. However, kind of at the turn of the 18th century, we start to see a different kind of conversation around dentistry start. And it's really started by Pierre Fouchard over in France. They become kind of the cool kids on the block when it comes to medical history, particularly dental medical innovation. And what he's really looking at and thinking about is kind of making this institutionalized, legitimate, not just the guy on the street who's drawing your teeth, but rather as they're kind of thinking about new technologies and new relationships with the body and new science, all that good stuff. They want to make teeth and dentistry legitimate. And that's his whole jam that he's doing. You can even see how he's sitting, gesturing to books, just like I'm gesturing to my books. See, I must be legitimate, right? I've got books behind me, right? He's doing the same thing. And that's how he's going to kind of approve this kind of process that happened starting in around 1700. We also started to get new tools. This is a tooth key, which the the Connecticut Museum has several examples of as well. They're terrifying. I'm not going to pretend like they're not terrifying, but they're better than what the big giant pliers were the blacksmith was using. They would often use these tools. So we're starting to get new information that's circulating. You're starting to get new tools to make these things easier and better to use. You're starting to get treatises published. Over 400 treatises are published in 100 years alone on all of this. You're starting to get it in newspapers telling you how to brush your teeth or what's the best way to whiten your teeth. Later at places like Litchfield Women's Academy and other schools, they're talking about teeth and dental care with students. So there's all this kind of swirling discourse, right? These conversations start to happen about teeth during this 18th century. And that's kind of like broad strokes of thing, but what I'm really curious about and what I'm curious about today is, okay, so we have that. And if there's anxiety around tooth loss, and you can't be a proper gentleman or a proper lady if you're missing teeth, so what do? Well, you get teeth from somewhere. And that gives us, we're going to start thinking about where do you get those teeth from? Because it's not until the 1820 that we start to get porcelain dentures and all of that. So before that, you got to get more creative. And that leads us to George Washington's dentures. We're going to hang out with George Washington's dentures for a while. As you might imagine, I know a lot about it. There's a lot on him because A, he's George Washington, and B, his dentist, John Greenwood, saved everything and wrote everything down, even inscribing the dentures, as you can see there. As an historian, I thank my lucky stars for John Greenwood every single day. But this is one of his early sets for Washington. And it's important to note that Washington struggled with dental health his entire life. When he took office at the age of 57, he only had one remaining tooth in his head. And granted, like the other problems with changing diets, longer life expectancy, he probably also had some genetic tendencies for this as well. And you can see that those dentures there, these are one of my favorites in the bottom, the kind of aerial shot on the bottom right side. You can see that bottom set, and there's a hole in it. And that hole is because that is the last remaining tooth that Washington had in his head when he took office. And so these dentures literally slotted in over that last tooth, acting as the anchor, right? We're not drilling into people's heads here. We're not putting in screws the way that we often do today. So you got to have some other way to attach it, right, to the mouth. And this was kind of one of those ways. Later, a couple years later, Washington actually loses his final tooth during the presidency, and Greenwood takes it home. And you can see it there in that image on the upper left in his watch fob. He actually saves Washington's last remaining tooth in his watch fob and wears it on him constantly. On the fob is also the key to turn his watch, his stamp, as well as a commemorative button of Washington that he received from the Marquis de Lafayette when he went to Paris in 1806, which we will be spending lots of time with Greenwood in Paris here in a little bit. So he's really crafting himself and being very transparent that, like, I was a dentist, I have this, and here's my relic for Washington. But Washington's most iconic set, this is the set that's currently housed at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And this is the kind of most famous set of dentures that Washington has. It's crafted by Greenwood in the 1790s or so. And it's really composed of a variety of different things. So one, you have both of the top and bottom are lead cast bases. There's then holes drilled at the bottom between every single tooth. You can see it's kind of parallel to the base, and then you have steel running through that. On the side, you have spring-loaded hinges, as well as they're wrapped in some copper and brass wire as well. So they needed to be spring-loaded for two reasons. One, once again, he has no more teeth in his head, so there's no way to attach it, right? So he's going to have that spring-loaded nature, but what that means is, and that allows him to more easily open and close his denture for speaking and for eating. It also means he has to keep his jaw tight like the whole time, because otherwise his mouth might pop open and they might pop out of his mouth, like it once happened to Charles Willson Peale while dining with Dolly Madison. So he's got a lot going on and having to think about, as well as the physical weight. These things weighed about a quarter of a pound in total that he's wearing in his mouth, and coated once again in lead. So there's no way that's gonna go wrong for him. But Greenwood is really innovative when he's crafting these. And part of it is because he's a tinkerer. He's coming from this tradition. His father did some kind of light industry work, but he was also trained as a cabinet maker. He was doing kind of silversmith. He was doing lithographs. That's why people like Paul Revere also at some point is pulling teeth as well, because there are these people with those kinds of skills. And Greenwood really kind of elevates that design in many ways. Now, the teeth themselves, that's what we're here about, tooth trade. Washington's dentures, so they are indeed crafted with human teeth. Some of them are possibly, those teeth are possibly from Europe, the Caribbean, or the newly independent United States. There's also some of the teeth are crafted out of ivory from Africa, as well as some North American domesticated animals. These are based loosely on designs that are coming out of France. There's metals like copper alloy that are mined in South America. So in short, Washington's really kind of holding this Atlantic world in his mouth, right? He has that Atlantic bite. But the Atlantic world both made and then later unmade his mouth as well, right? Because of the ivory that's on there, ivory takes on a lot of staining. And Washington would frequently complain about kind of the mouth pain. They're really bulky. They're constantly being stained and making eating really difficult. However, both as president and then the former president, Washington was expected to give a lot of this in the social ritual of dining in the 18th century. And part of that is a bunch of toast. You'd like be toasting all night, primarily with Madeira, which is a fortified red wine coming off the coast of Portugal. The problem with drinking a lot of red wine is that it's going to stain that ivory, because ivory has no enamel on it, right? And so it's going to get damaged really, really quickly. So much so that Washington is sending these dentures back to his dentist, John Greenwood, fairly regularly. At one point, Greenwood even writes, I received them very black, occasioned either by your soaking them in port wine or by the drinking of it. I advise you to either take them out after dinner and put them in clean water and put in another set, right? So because of that ivory, those ivory teeth, they absorb that staining from the coffee, tea, and Madeira, and that kind of results in that wood grain effect a little bit, which might be where the myth of the wooden teeth came from. I have another alternative argument, but I'm not, we'll get to that one later. But that's where folks get it. So thus, throughout Washington's adult lifetime, he's in a constant need for human teeth. Human teeth are the gold standard for dentures because they're not going to be staining. They're going to look more realistic in other kinds of ways. So he's in a constant demand for them. Washington is not alone in this. There is a huge influx of and demand for teeth in early America as more things like bridges and dentures are being crafted. Once again, so you don't have that anxiety of tooth loss, right? Because it had all those connotations that were mapped onto it. This becomes such big business, and throughout the 18th century, they're literally importing human teeth by the keg. So where are these teeth coming from? One potential source for Washington specifically teeth is been part and kind of used in part of the new myth-making narrative around Washington. It's often employed to illuminate the deeply intertwined lives, and rightfully so, intertwined lives between enslavers and the enslaved as kind of a metaphor for the foundational role and the embeddedness of slavery in the founding of our country. Because there is some speculation that Washington's dentures contain teeth taken from the enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Now, this narrative has been circulated on the internet, both from reliable and less reliable sources. So like JSTOR is great. The New York Post, less great. And this also really came part of the conversation during the national discourses in 2020 around the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. And the reason why there's this speculation that those teeth are potentially from the enslaved population is because we do know that Washington did indeed purchase from the enslaved at Mount Vernon. So one of the things we'll say is we don't know what happens to these teeth that they are purchased. So in May of 1784, Washington purchases 9 teeth on behalf of a French dentist, Jean-Pierre Lemaire, and gives that to him. Now, we don't know exactly what ends up happening with those 9 individual teeth, right? This is before Washington has kind of formal sets of dentures. However, Lemaire is involved in some practices where maybe they were used. But what we do know that is somewhat typical during this time, the late 18th century, with the process of enslavement, it wasn't uncommon for enslavers to purchase eggs, produce, game, other things like that from the enslaved population. However, a physical and removable part of someone's body is very different than some chicken eggs, particularly given the potential for the extraction process itself. So while we don't know what exactly comes to those teeth, we do know for sure that Washington purchased them well below the market value. You would typically get, he only ends up paying about 6 pounds and 2 shillings. That's less than half of what those teeth would be sold on the open marketplace. So we don't know where they ended up in his mouth. We don't know exactly where they ended up, but either way, he's being a little shady and through this process and exploiting the population that is there. We know, for example, as well, Washington's not alone in this. Enslavers are really fascinated by the teeth of the enslaved. Certainly during the transatlantic slave trade itself is a key part of things, but they're also reading and keeping track of that. So many runaway ads, for example, all comment on the teeth and in surprising detail. So they're keenly aware and tracking kind of what does the mouth look like of the enslaved population, and are using that to assess things rather than the loveliness and ability to publicly speak, as we saw for the ladies and gentlemen of Richard Skinner. Instead, they're utilizing it to assess potential health and other types of issues, right? So they're keenly aware of these teeth that's happening, and as they're moving through. But this is where we also see selling teeth was not a particularly uncommon thing throughout this time. You open any 18th century newspaper, you're going to find advertisements like this. So this is Dr. Lemaire, who did indeed end up doing who was the one that Washington purchased the teeth for. He's traveling up and down the East Coast, stopping in these cities, and he is willing to both like perform these different procedures, as well as he would buy teeth. So 2 guineas for your front teeth was a common cost. Once again, he got a very good deal thanks to the exploitation of the enslaved population there at Mount Vernon. But Lemaire needs these teeth for other reasons. He's not necessarily building dentures and all of that. He's instead engaging in what's live tooth transplants, which was the like fad thing that happened in the 18th century, where you take one tooth and remove it from someone to another. This is actually a British political cartoon by Thomas Rawlinson. And we can see there, and this is, people are buying and selling teeth for all kinds of purposes, in this case for transplants. But we can see you have this like chimney, just like soot covered chimney sweep there in the center, right? Mouth open as a dentist like reaches over to remove a tooth. We have a wealthy woman kind of pointing at kind of which one she wants, right? And we have these other kind of figures that are like sulking off in pain in the background, right? And so there was a really common practice of poor folks selling teeth. For those who are musical fans, this happens in Les Mis, right? This happens in throughout kind of history as well. But we see this great acceleration of it through this time period because there is such a demand to make sure that you don't have those gaps in your teeth. Of course, the people selling their teeth are now going to have those gaps and will be permanently barred from being seen as part of that elite community now. So some of the places that might be getting teeth, as a recap, one, potentially from enslaved populations that are coming from, or no, we know they're coming from there, but Washington teeth might be from that specifically. Coming from poor ones that are purchased from poor folk. The other kind of place, this is a fun one. The other kind of place might be coming from is Battlefield Dead, but before that, I have to talk about John Hunter's. John Hunter's the one who invented live tooth transplant, and he believed in vitalism, so a connecting force that would connect all of us. He was a big advocate for it. He was a big medical guy over in Scotland. So this is a mummified rooster because he embedded in the head of the rooster a tooth to see if it would grow. And it did connect, and the rooster went on to lead a happy life and is now currently in the museum. But it means that they're really experimenting with all these different things, because once again, when you're not drilling into people's heads, so how the heck are we going to get all these teeth in people, right? If we're going to now have anxiety around tooth loss. And this is where John Greenwood comes back into play. So once again, Greenwood was the dentist for Washington, who's making these dentures for him. Now, the other potential source is coming from Battlefield Dead. Human teeth were collected from fallen soldiers in European wars throughout this time period, about 100 years. I mean, there's a lot of warfare that is happening, a lot of displacement of people and resources. So it wasn't uncommon to scavenge the bodies of the battlefield dead for goods and valuables that can be sold. And this includes human teeth as well. And these were then frequently referred to later as Waterloo teeth after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, because there were thousands and thousands and thousands of teeth were extracted from the Battle of Waterloo and then sent out for transport. In some sort of grim, cycle during the American Civil War, the same thing happened where many of the Civil War dead's bodies were scavenged and teeth were extracted and actually sent back to Europe later then. So what goes around comes around to some degree. But we were looking at this kind of relationship or this trade that's happening with battlefield dead teeth. Greenwood really comes into prominence for us in his visit to France in 1806. So Greenwood, he's a Revolutionary War veteran, so he feels great affinity for the French and for the Marquis de Lafayette and other folks like that he interacted with, as well as he's interested in the kind of the medical pursuits. So in 1806, he travels to France to meet with both the Marquis de Lafayette and some of these other kind of folks that he knew, meet with some of the kind of bigwigs in the dentistry community. And while he's there, he starts talking to folks and about kind of these, swapping stories. Like if you go to any kind of professional conference, right? You start trading tips. He then returns in 1807, and throughout early 1807, Greenwood begins negotiating with a French surgeon dentist, Monsieur Bosquet, who was also taught English at the Imperial Lyceum College there in Paris. They go back and forth for a while, and Bosquet writes in March that he would be willing to sell Greenwood through a factor, this guy named Lynch, that he is willing to sell 4,300 human teeth for 2,628 francs, or 438 pieces of silver. I'm going to say that again. He agrees to sell him 4,300 human teeth. And I got the receipts to prove it. So they're literally kind of sending these out. However, they ended up creating, and I don't know if you can see their teeth, there's bad and good. They're really identifying kind of which ones are good. In case you're wondering, 4,300 human teeth is equivalent to about 135 mouths of a complete set. So the human has about 32 teeth, including wisdom teeth. So this is about 135 people's mouths we're talking about here. But then Greenwood gets this shipment, and he's a little cranky. I know it's a little faded. It might be difficult to read, but this is literally an itemized receipt that Greenwood Craig, he goes through his 4,300 teeth, and he learns he does not have 4,300. He has 4,211. He goes through and identifies how much he has for good teeth, front teeth, eye teeth. So for example, front teeth are the most valuable. Those are those front ones. The eye teeth, which are what we would now call canines, but they're called eye teeth because they're under the eye. And he writes they're good for nothing. He writes how many he gets that are literally rotten. So in other words, he kind of gets all of this shipment, but it contained much less than what he wanted and was much more of poor quality. So he later tries to come up with creative ways to get rid of these teeth, which I'll get to in a moment. But the fact of this transaction, right, this international shipment of human teeth bears the markings of any other commodity purchased during this time period. There's negotiation. There's working with a factor. There's an itemized receipt. And there's a frustration in quality control, right? But unlike things like Madeira or a bolt of calico, the commodity is human teeth, and it's extracted either from the dead or sold by the poor. Now, this is a level of kind of mercantile sophistication. This really indicates that this 1807 shipment, it was not an isolated event by any means. And actually is part of this kind of larger transnational, transatlantic tooth trade that's circulating throughout the Atlantic world. In other words, because this is a calculated, very calculated business transaction, like just any other at the time, that tells us that it's not particularly unique, nor is there a kind of moral ambivalence about it, right? This is a standardized process. There's letters that are going back and forth. It's really kind of like checking the boxes of other kind of merchant purchases at the time. In other words, this is business as usual. So this is where Washington's potentially getting his teeth, right? So they might be coming from battlefield dead over in Europe. They might be coming from poor folk either in Europe or in the United States selling their teeth. They might be coming from the enslaved. But what it means is that Washington is always in this constant demand for teeth, and he is not alone for that demand. And so we start to see this big economy developing throughout the Atlantic world of people buying teeth. Once again, they're literally buying teeth by the keg and importing it by the keg to early America during this time period. But then Greenwood's now he's got all these teeth and he doesn't know what to do with them. So he ends up trying to, like any salesman who gets a bum set of goods, he tries to find other uses for them, or a sucker born every minute, And so he's not only, here is one of his many advertisements he has about people can come to see his work and all of that. He's always associated with Greenwood, but he also then starts sending out teeth at kind of individual rates. So rather than doing just kind of full denture sets, which is expensive, so only certain kind of elites are going to be able to have that, like Washington, like Peel, you start sending out individual teeth. And so what this is a small wooden tooth that is a model of a tooth that one of his patients that he had given one of these bum teeth to She had it inserted into like one of her bridges, but she was on vacation and it fell out. And just like if you're on vacation today and your glasses break or whatever, you know, you call your doctor and you get something shipped quickly. Well, the problem is Greenwood didn't know what exact size he needed. So this woman's husband whittles this little wooden tooth and sends it down to Greenwood so that he knows what size to send back to her from these 4,211 human teeth that he gets. Now, I don't know for sure yet, but I wonder, and there's several of these in the Greenwood papers, how much of this might be some of that foundation for the wooden teeth myth with Washington. If they're using these kind of small little wooden whittle, they would not have been utilized or employed in the mouth, but rather as a way of building and communicating about teeth that is going through here. And this gets us back. And so there you see Washington, there's just once again, he's gotten all these different, these people and places are coming from all these different worlds. And he needs that to be seen to not have tooth loss as this gentleman, as this public speaker, as a respectable member of society. And this takes us back to our friend Richard Skinner, who we started with, who's going from New York City, he's going to Connecticut, he's going back and forth, and he ends up writing a treatise on human teeth. It's only about 17 pages, but you can see there at the bottom, he talks about, I shall briefly describe their structure, number, order of arrangement, time they began to appear, diseases and decay, remedies, proper mode of extraction and preservation, etc., etc. And he's crafting this book because he's moving back and forth and he's starting to move to Connecticut. And he wants to be able to sell this treatise. But more than that, if he's got a treatise, just like earlier in the period when we were thinking about the institutionalization, the medical things, how do you create someone legitimate? He is now legitimate because he has a book that he has written. And he wants to have that legitimacy because he's about to get married and move to Hartford. So in 1802, he marries Miss Mary Whitman. They move to Hartford, Connecticut. And there he starts selling more and more of not only the products that he crafts, he's buying and selling human teeth, he's selling his treaties, he's really kind of moving around through that kind of space and that environment. He ultimately ends up kind of going into business with one of the local gentlemen. We can find their records in the insurance claims. They go into business together, kind of selling these different things. So we know he had a shop. But what that means is he's also not moving around in an itinerant way, right? There's enough business that he can stay put to be able to sell dentistry, right? To sell dental care, to sell the tools for dentistry. But what that also means is that Skinner is also in conversation with people like George Washington and Greenwood, right? He's buying and selling the teeth while it's maybe at a much smaller world, with every kind of tooth that he sells, with every kind of or he buys the tooth, or every kind of dentifrice that he sells, every treatise that he signs over, hasn't really published. And his treatise, by the way, was fairly widely circulated. I have found it in a fair amount of archives. It's not just at Connecticut. I've seen it several other places, and it took me so long to connect him to Connecticut. So that was a really exciting day in the archive to be like, I found him finally. But he is now connected to this entire Atlantic world, right? Because he is still not only buying these products and buying in the notion and communicating and selling the idea that front tooth loss is going to diminish your beauty or your ability to publicly speak or perform, to be in public, to be taken seriously, right? So he is part of this that connects him far beyond just the confines and the borders of Connecticut, but really connects him across the entire Atlantic. And we can see that in George Washington's teeth, and we can see it in Skinner too, as he is existing with these ideas. So there we go. Thank you very much, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm just going to stop the share screen for a second. There we go. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll tackle some questions. If you'd like, you can certainly unmute yourself today, if that's easier.
I know it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. Like it's one of those topics that sounds really kind of fun at first, but it gets real dark real fast.
Can you just walk us through a little bit about some of the material that you're finding in the archives that's really useful?
Yeah, so a lot of it, as I mentioned, were account books and ledgers. I mean, those are receipts essentially. So think about your own life. You learn a lot about someone based on their receipts, right? You can know probably more than you ever need to know about them. And so that has been a huge part of what I'm looking at. I literally have nightmares about ledgers now as a result, because straight to these 18th century kind of like these account books day in day out. So that's the hard part, is there isn't kind of a tooth. There wasn't a tooth archive that existed, right? These are all hodgepodges there. So they're buried in kind of account books. Other sources have been particularly useful are seminary records. So a lot of these girls' schools that are coming up after the American Revolution, like the one in the Litchfield Academy there in Connecticut, the Moravians down in Bethlehem, and these other kinds of boarding schools, essentially. They have rules about dental care. They're writing about it. I even found a particular letter from a mother writing to a principal, and she's very upset that her daughter has not gotten to the dentist, and it's going to ruin her marriage prospects, and it's his fault that she's not going to succeed in life, right? So they're starting, so like you have places like that, as well as kind of visual evidence as well. So when I was there, in the museum, and I got to go down into the stacks and see a lot of the portraiture there, because we can also track in portraiture when people start essentially photoshopping in teeth, whereas earlier period it would be pretty obvious that someone didn't have teeth. So those tend to be kind of my main sources, as well as over the 400 treatises, things like cookbooks, newspapers, and if I get really lucky, I get to find a little diary or something like that, as well.
Awesome, thank you. Sonia has a question. What did folks use for pain management during extraction and after the teeth were in their mouth?
Nothing really. I mean, so it is difficult, I think, for us to comprehend today how much pain people were in kind of all the time. So I mean, there wasn't any kind of and actually the first time of where we're starting to see, in a Connecticut story as well, kind of starting to see actual pain management and all of that is later, and actually it's for dentists first, because that nerve ending pain it's something special. So the main use for medication or pain management, you wanted to get done fast, you want to get done quick, and there were a lot of home recipes I found in a lot of like cookbooks and things like that, recipes for like salves you could create or balms to then put on it afterward. It would have kind of a numbing effect, so it often had things like cloves and things like that. There's also a medicinal plant that we now call the toothache plant. If you can get it at hippy dippy grocery stores for dental care, but it actually creates like a numbing sensation in your gum. So there were some kind of remedies like that, but those are more for kind of aftercare. If you were lucky, you got a shot of rum, kind of a thing. But there just wasn't that kind of world, and nor was, I think, their expectation for it either. People just expected to be in pain.
Yikes. Oh my goodness. Cheryl had a question. Do you have any knowledge about Ben Franklin having any of these teeth replacements?
So not that I've seen, and it's not come up. I mean, he was certainly obviously engaged in all these like scientific conversations, but he's also a slightly different generation, right? So he's a little bit older, than Washington and, than Charles Wilson Peel and all of that. So, I mean, he doesn't get quite as kind of caught up in that kind of the changing connotation of tooth loss, right? So I haven't seen him kind of having that done, but I would reckon it's because he's a little bit older than that, though he is certainly engaging in these conversations, these debates. I'm sure he had teeth extracted and things like that, but one of those things, if it's a mundane thing, it doesn't tend to get written down, unless you can find the doctor's ledger and then try to recreate it back, which I'm doing with all my ledgers, which is a nightmare, but it's a fun game. It's a fun little puzzle that I get to do as well. So the answer is not that I've encountered yet, but it doesn't mean it's not necessarily there, but he certainly would have been engaged with some of the medical kind of conversations of the day. And he does have many teeth related puns and cheeky little sayings in like the Poor Richard's Almanac and other things like that. So he's certainly playing with the language of teeth.
Anyone else have any questions you'd like to put in the chat or unmute yourself?
I have a question. So I noticed in some of the like images of people getting their tooth extract, like especially in the political cartoon, the person is darker, or like they seem very much in pain, or they're like everything's exaggerated. And I'm trying to like find if there's like symbolism in that, or if like it was to try to find humor in the situation, or I'm like going in a
Yeah, no,
circle.
exactly, because I think that's a great point, and I think there is that kind of like visual response to that. So there's several things happening there, and there's a lot I could say on that. I think several things are happening. One, first of all, in that kind of that British cartoon, there, you know, the anxiety that that darkness, that color was there mainly because it indicate kind of chimney sweep status, right? So there, I think for given our history in this country, we're seeing that through a race lens, right? In many ways. In the UK, their anxiety is more about class at this point, right? So they're trying to give really clear class connotations about that. There are some prints that I've seen as well, coming out of the UK or coming out of England, that show kind of elegant. There's one famous one in particular that has like an elegant lady with a like mouth open, a dentist there, and an enslaved young boy there with like a cheeky grin kind of pointing at his teeth, kind of implying that, you know, there's a relationship there. And so I think, you know, so I think there's certainly that kind of element happening. And one of the things that I look at in my larger work and dissertation, I have entire chapters dedicated to, is that essentially people develop all these different ways, systems of meanings, ways of reading teeth. So today I really wanted to think about reading it as like gentleman and lady, and why there's anxiety about teeth loss, why is Washington anxiety about it. But they're also reading teeth really different, and that changes on what your class, your gender, and your raced body is. And so, you know, and there isn't, sometimes I've gotten questions, was there anxiety about racial purity or racial mixing by taking teeth from enslaved Africans? And I've yet to see that kind of anxiety about it. And the reason I think it is, there isn't, that is, you know, there was already inherent such fluidity. I mean, it was not uncommon for enslaved African American women to breastfeed, you know, white enslavers' children, right? So there's already this kind of culture of exchange, forced exchange, you know, that's happening there. And so I think there's less anxiety about that. However, the fact that we later then see the rise, particularly of teeth and smiles, with a lot of stereotyping, right, and a lot of certain kinds of imagery, I think that gets a little bit solidified a little bit later, you know, but it's still, we're trying to see those kind of roots there. And part of it is because enslavers are tracking enslaved bodies, and they're tracking their teeth, and they're tracking their mouth, and they're reading it really different than how they're going to be reading it on a George Washington, if that makes sense.
Lucy, can you talk a little bit about this idea of transplanting teeth? Was that a practice that was popular? Was it successful? I'm assuming expensive.
It was expensive. It was a fad. There was about like 10, 15 years where it was a fad, and it was it successful? No, not really. Not really, or it was only successful for small periods of time. And so, like I said, but it was championed by John Hunter, who was like one of the big guys in kind of medical history at this time. He's in England. He's like one of the leading surgeons. He writes extensively on this. He's a big fan of it. And so it gets kind of circulated throughout. And so there is even some cases of women, delicate, you know, gentle ladies, having all of their teeth extracted and having all of these put in so they can all be like perfect teeth. It doesn't work out well for them, as you might imagine. But there are cases when and there's a very good chance, but there's no evidence to suggest, there's no tangible evidence, but there's less circumstantial evidence to suggest that Washington probably may have tried this procedure as well, since the dentist he sold the 9 enslaved teeth to, that was this guy's bread and butter. But eventually it falls out of fashion, one, because it doesn't work very well, and two, it becomes associated with venereal disease. So basically, if you have in this type of syphilis, you would take mercury. That is your way to cure yourself. That A doesn't work, but B, it also syphilis leads to tooth loss. Mercury leads to even more tooth loss. So there was anxiety about that, as well as then there was all of this spike of these lovely ladies, these gentlewomen, who would get this procedure done and then all of a sudden end up with syphilis. And so therefore, it's got to be coming through the tooth, right? Like this is the logic system. So it really kind of falls out of fashion, doesn't work. And actually, even John Greenwood, he has one of John Hunter's publication, and in the marginalia, I mean, half the book, every single line, he is fighting with Greenwood. He's like, you don't know anything about what you're doing if you're ever going to say that. That's not how the tooth works. I've been 24 years in the profession. Like he's basically like Facebook arguing with John Hunter, like in the actual text. So like it became to be associated with kind of charlatans and other folks who were not bona fide dentists.
Awesome. Karen has a question. She wants to know if you see any connection to today's fashions for pulling or decorating or adding veneers to teeth.
Absolutely. I mean, I think once again, we read people based on their mouth and their smile. We make judgments and assessments based on their smile, right? And these things are culturally relative, right? Because at the same time that this is happening, there's accounts in other parts of the world that I've encountered where like blackened teeth, that was the sign of beauty, right? These things are not, these are culturally relevant, or in certain communities having like a tooth gap is seen as really desirable, right? So these things are these are malleable. So things like veneers or adding on kind of teeth decoration or gold teeth, things like that, those things are gonna be kind of culture dependent. But once again, it's all about the other person reading you, right? They're reading your body and they're making judgments and assessments. They're cataloging you based kind of on that information. But yes, as I certainly think as well that I think that there's a Americans' particular fascination with teeth and having clean, white, bright, straight teeth. If you've ever traveled abroad, they always joking and tell an American by how bright and straight your teeth is. Like it is very much a cultural trope that we're now kind of exporting. But I do think that this is during this moment, because it gets so associated with kind of virtue and character and commerce, that's one of the reasons why we as Americans we got sucked into that world in the way that like the Brits, for example, did not, even though they're one of the birthplaces of kind of modern dentistry. And so we're still reading people's bodies. We're still doing it today. And if if they like they said, they say if you, I believe if I recall correctly, for every tooth you lose on average $1,000 of income a month, because people are making kind of judgments and assessments on you. So we still have connotations around tooth loss. It is still the biggest thing that they say, like I said, for executive training, or for if you're going to be on camera, or like even in my profession doing public speaking, like it is encouraged to do this. And it's part of that process.
Wow. Anybody else have any questions today? Can certainly add it to the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. Anybody?
This was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have to say I learned a lot. Joe is asking, did there come a time when people felt concerned for those whose teeth were pulled? Looking at the other side of the coin.
Do you mean concerned about the donors, for lack of a word, and like their health, or concerned about where it was coming from? I don't know if that makes sense. I can answer both. The donors.
The donors.
Yeah. So yes and no. So there was still, I mean, even past my kind of time period that I look at, which is kind of this early American Republic period, like post-Civil War, for example, and one of the reasons why our health insurance and our medical and dental insurance are separate is because of this kind of feuding idea, really from the foundation from like 1830 between dentists and doctors. Doctors really wanted to distance themselves from dentists, because while they were certainly on this professionalization journey, right, things like Skinner, who's having the treaties, he's having a shop, kind of all of that, there's also still a lot of folks that are circulating, pulling teeth in kind of performance ways. There's still, there's still like shady actors out there. And so they really want to distance themselves from that. And so that's why these worlds become pretty separate, and that means that there's kind of still a continuation. So there are certainly like examples of, like, if you were to have roping on a Christmas tree made out of popcorn, but like all teeth of people that they would pull, you know, there was still, so they would have that there, but there starting in 1820, there's no longer a demand for human teeth for dentures because we start to get better technologies. There's basically an arms race that starts happening to try to figure out what is the best tool way to make artificial teeth, right? Because moving goods of human teeth becomes tricky. So if you get artificial teeth, it's going to be kind of better. And so you start to see that. I mean, even Wedgwood, the famous dishes, right? Porcelain, he even gets in trying to experiment to try to find good artificial teeth. That's how much demand there was. This is big business. So there's kind of a lesson into more of the teeth pulling that happens is more done out of pain and then less for circulation. That, as I did mention, there were some teeth that ended up from the Civil War back in Europe. There still is some, people are still putting them together and building these kinds of Frankenstein dentures in other ways. But so they become less concerned about where the donors or the fate of the donors. It becomes more kind of a thing of pain prevention. And then later in the early 20th century, there's a lot of big public health measures to try to help folk with their kind of dental pain and having good dental health. It got really tied up in kind of Americanization and that sort of thing. Because we're good Americans and we like having good teeth. And so that's when the anxiety about it, not so like donating it to sell teeth, but rather the anxiety is about, we've now removed your teeth out of pain and all of that. You can no longer you can't be a true American. So that's what the anxiety is more about the donor from this kind of patronizing perspective, rather than like, hey, we have a population of people that are like so hard up, they're really selling parts of their body. That there's not that kind of anxiety.
Wow. I'm saying wow a lot today. This is all very fascinating. Anyone else have any questions for Lucy today? Anybody? Well, thank you so much, Lucy. This was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot. I really enjoyed this presentation. I can't wait to read the book when it's all put together.
Thank you so much for coming and giving up your lunch break to hang out and talk about teeth with me.
Before I close out today's Zoom, I just want to share a couple of upcoming programs that we have going on at the Connecticut Museum. On Thursday the 5th, next week, we have an evening program telling new stories, ties to the Caribbean in the Ancient Burying Ground, which is in Hartford. Dr. Catherine Hermes will talk about a bunch of stories to illuminate people who have built connections between Connecticut and the Caribbean. And then we have another Lunch and Learn on the 10th. Will McLean Greeley, who is the great nephew of Senator George McLean, wrote a book, and he's going to talk about his book, how Senator McLean really established these lasting legal protections for birds with the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So that should be interesting. And then we have a new exhibit opening on October 12th, Thursday. So we're having a reception. Please join us. It's open to the public. Our new exhibit is called Connecticut's Bookshelf. And this exhibit will really explore how documents and books were made here in Connecticut, shared and received from the 1700s to today. So it's a really fascinating look at publishing and the books as well. And Connecticut does have a lot of firsts, I will say. So that should be a great new exhibit. So hopefully you can join us for these events. And we certainly can find a list of all our programming at connecticutmuseum.org. And I just want to say thank you again to Lucy for a fascinating talk today at lunchtime. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a good day. Bye, everyone.